England 1381 was a powder keg. The Black Death had killed nearly half the population, upending the labour market and fueling a peasant class who was increasingly aware of its real value and becoming increasingly resented for it by the elite. Wage controls and harsh poll taxes for an unpopular French war, coupled with a fractured Catholic Church divided by rival popes and perpetuating inequality through tithes, ignited peasant resentment. Though capitalism emerged with wage labour, villeinage and corrupt justices bound peasants in servitude, with legal records chaining them to a feudal past. The regressive 1380 poll tax was the spark. The revolt that followed was not just an eruption of class anger, it was a calculated attempt to destroy the records and institutions that held people in place, and the level of coordination strongly suggests premeditation. Yorkshire rebels wore uniforms, southern rebels moved with synchronicity and discipline, and targeted key power centres. What appeared as spontaneous fury may actually have been planned agitation. The revolt spread quickly from Essex and Kent to London, but the rebels weren't merely looters. They burned manorial records, court rolls and debt charters with surgical precision. Many religious houses were torched, not because of piety lost, but because these institutions had become landlords, creditors and enforcers of oppression. The Knights Hospitallers properties were targeted with unusual intensity. Their London priory at Clerkenwell was attacked and burned. Yet the Temple Church, once the English headquarters of the Knights Templar and now a legal centre under Hospitaller ownership, was spared. Rebels stormed it, yes, taking records outside to burn away from the building, but the church itself was left untouched. Curiously, rebels captured the Tower of London with ease, the most secure royal fortress in the land. The drawbridge was down, portcullis up. They executed the Lord Chancellor and others, while King Richard II met rebels at Mile End. The previously unheard of Wat Tyler became the rebel leader, whose appearance was as sudden as his strategy. Tyler prioritised the tower over a royal audience, suggesting strategic planning, not chaos. There are too many clean breaks, too many careful preservations. This wasn't really a wild mob. It was a sophisticated act of symbolic and strategic violence, and it smells of scripting. John J. Robinson's, whose brilliant book Born in Blood proposed a compelling and controversial view that the Peasants' Revolt may have had roots in the underground survival of the Knights Templar, who after their suppression in 1312 went underground in England. Robinson argues compellingly that Freemasonry emerged from the hidden Templar network, carrying with it symbols, rituals, and a seething resentment of the church and monarchy that betrayed them. In this reading, the Hospitallers' Temple Church was spared because it was sacred, not to the crown or church, but to those underground networks who saw it as a temple of the true order. The church had been built by the Knights Templar in the 12th century and modelled upon the church, the Holy Sepulchre, in Jerusalem. Legal documents were removed from the building and burned. This destruction wasn't random, it was revenge, not against the idea of law, but against the specific institutions that had inherited Templar holdings, perverted justice and sold out the Brotherhood. Robinson's theory explains something conventional historians struggle to answer clearly, and that is, why would rebels burn records at the temple but not destroy the building when they were otherwise happy to sack churches and palaces? However, as much as I appreciate Robinson's work and agree with much of it, he walks into a contradiction. He acknowledges in his earlier book that the Templars traded with Saracens and conspired with the assassins in the East, showing deep pragmatism. There were also rumours of relations with the Mongols. But Robinson portrays their relationship with the Knights Hospitaller as purely as a rivalry and hostile. and I find this historically a little thin. The two orders often fought side by side, they shared fortresses and worked towards overlapping goals, even if they competed for papal favour and resources. So why draw such a sharp line? I believe a more historically grounded interpretation would see the Templars and Hospitallers not as ideological enemies, but as branches of the same clerical military architecture. Both reported to the Pope, both had transnational assets, both served as the martial arms of Christendom. Their rivalry was real, but so was their alignment of interests, especially when those interests intersected with Rome, much like the Venetians and the Genovese. After the suppression of the Templars in 1312, much of their property was transferred to the Knights Hospitaller by papal decree. However, the Templars were never truly eradicated. Their vast treasure was never found, their naval fleet vanished from records, and many members reportedly found refuge in Portugal, where King Denis reorganised them under the Order of Christ. Additionally, there is both legend and debated evidence suggesting the Templar presence in Scotland, particularly during a period of papal hostility towards the Scottish crown. And in England, the Inner and Middle Temples, the heart of the legal profession, bear their name and arguably their legacy. What looks like disappearance is better understood as migration, from fortress to court, from sword to statute. These threads in Robinson's work suggest the Templars may have survived by going underground, rebranding or merging with allied institutions, much of which Robinson outlines alongside their need for esoteric communication methods. I don't believe the Hospitallers betrayed their brothers, rather the papacy needed a clean institutional handover. The Temple Church remained in use, not as mystical ruin, but as a legal and financial centre, the kind of apparatus essential to the developing English state. And this may be why it was protected. The church's structure was preserved because its symbolic and institutional value endured, but its records were destroyed, perhaps by rebels who saw them as tools of bondage, while other actors may have wanted to erase evidence of perhaps Templar Hospitaller continuities. Seemingly for both parties, the enemy was not the building, the enemy was the paper. And so did the Crown and Parliament gain from the revolt? Well, the outcome is telling, for after the revolt, the Parliament's authority grew, especially in tax policy. The King's image as a divinely guided restorer of order was reinforced. The radical wing of the revolt was decapitated, literally and figuratively. The legal records of feudal obligations and potential elite corruption were destroyed without implicating Parliament or the Crown directly. Any remaining traces of state collusion, Templar Hospitaller continuity, or land deals too compromising to survive were erased. Now, if we just consider a thought experiment that secret fraternities with roots in the old military orders could still have existed and that their loyalties transcended public offices, the revolt perhaps begins to look different. Not like chaos, but like cover. The Peasants' Revolt removed archival liabilities, neutralised the radical masses, and left the Crown more powerful than before. That's not much of a revolt. If surviving Templar networks or their heirs were involved in the Peasants' Revolt, the 70-year delay wasn't hesitation, it was strategic timing. For after the 1312 suppression, their priorities would have been survival, concealment, and slow reintegration through institutions like the Hospitallers or merchant guilds. By 1381, conditions were ideal. Widespread resentment from the Black Death, punitive taxation, and a fragile monarchy created the perfect storm that we have covered in this playlist so far. And if uniforms were being stitched in Yorkshire long before the first tax collector was attacked, then this wasn't just a peasant uprising. It was a generational playbook entering its endgame. So therefore, my focus then turned to whether there had been a broader pattern of attacks on the Hospitallers and their properties across the European continent. Initially, there were no major signs, but 40 years later, the German peasants' revolt of 1524 erupted, propelled by Lutheran and radical ideologies. It marked the next major wave of upheaval. In the decades that followed, similar actions emerged in France, Italy, Malta, and parts of Eastern Europe. By this time, the Hospitallers had become foreign landlords, militarized elites, and functionaries aligned with both papal and royal authority. They were no longer merely religious figures, they had become administrators of empire. That made them easy targets and, more importantly, politically useful scapegoats. But just as in the 1381 Rising in England, a curious pattern reappears. Hospitaller properties were razed, yet some buildings were spared that again were of state importance, such as Le Temple, Paris, Fort St. Angelo in Malta, and others. Records were deliberately destroyed. Officials were selectively assassinated. Yet the core institutional structure was left standing. It's hard to believe this was spontaneous. It looks increasingly methodical, and across England, the Holy Roman Empire and the Mediterranean, rebels did not just riot, they executed attacks on paper infrastructure with a remarkable degree of focus. They went after ledgers, tax rolls, title deeds, and legal registers. The objects of destruction were not symbols of faith, but engines of administration. What they burned was not religion, but record keeping. This was not a blind rage, it was a form of anti-archive warfare, a precise and repeated assault on the paperwork of power. And the pattern is consistent: erase the evidence, but keep the architecture. John J. Robinson's work proposes that the Templars survived their formal suppression by fragmenting, going underground, and preserving their memory through coded rituals and esoteric structures. The Hospitallers, by contrast, survived with alignment. They adapted their public face while quietly consolidating their assets. What looked like institutional continuity was in fact controlled transformation, but it was legitimized by the very system that had destroyed their supposed rivals. The revolts did not destroy the Hospitallers, they refined them. Each episode of chaos became a moment for quiet restructuring. Old debts and inconvenient archives were lost. Liability was burned, reputation was repurposed. They moved from the battlefield to the court, from warrior monks to diplomatic actors. Today, under the banner of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, they maintain the appearance of tradition while operating as something else entirely. They are recognized as a sovereign entity with permanent observer status at the United Nations, formal diplomatic relations with over 100 countries, their own passports, currency and postage, as well as a worldwide logistics and hospital infrastructure. This is not a historical remnant. It is a parallel sovereign system, a Vatican with knights. Their survival strategy was rooted in adaptability. They evolved from crusaders into medical caretakers, a quiet clearance for capital. At every stage, their documents were burned, their buildings remained, their critics were crushed, the state reabsorbed the authority. The target was never the Hospitallers themselves. The target was what they could no longer afford to be seen holding. Amongst the most dangerous records destroyed were those that traced noble bloodlines, chronicled feudal obligations, documented debt arrangements, clarified land ownership, revealed corrupt financial exchanges, or tied elites to heretical or disgraced associations. These documents, had they survived, could have shattered claims to power, invalidated successions, opened up land disputes, or exposed treasonous dealings. Their destruction was not only convenient, it was necessary. The implications for the emerging capitalist order were significant. The destruction of these records did not merely erase the past, it cleared the way for a different kind of legitimacy to take root. Power no longer depended solely on noble bloodlines, feudal obligations, or ecclesiastical sanction. It could now be grounded in contract, currency and state recognition. Property rights were redefined, ancestral claims dissolved, monarchs and rising bureaucracies filled the vacuum. With new legal frameworks, land could be bought, sold and taxed without the weight of centuries pressing on every transaction. In the ashes of these ledgers and charters, a quieter revolution unfolded. The old scaffolding of privilege was removed, but the structure remained intact. Wealth replaced birthright. The recordless elite emerged cleansed of entanglement, ready to operate within a system that favoured liquidity over legacy, bureaucracy over blood. Capitalism did not just rise through accumulation, it advanced through selective forgetting, and in that forgetting a new kind of continuity was secured. This was not a revolt or a collapse, it was a transfer, and of course it certainly wasn't Europe's first false flag.